So today I'm going to be talking to you about some of the work that I've been doing with the Survey of the Health of Wisconsin. As mentioned, my name is Jackie Cronin, and I have been working with SHOW for about the past year now. So I'm going to go quickly through some of the context, as I'm sure most of you are aware that most countries now have been acknowledging the mental health impacts of COVID-19. And a lot of previous infectious disease outbreaks have shown that psychological symptoms can sometimes affect behavioral choices, including the Ebola outbreak in 2014 to 2015. We saw that increased fears and hopelessness led to decreases in preventative measures. And we've also seen similar PTSD-related avoidance behaviors in SARS and MERS coronavirus outbreaks. And a lot of the COVID-19 research going on right now has focused on specific populations, including individuals with prior psychological diagnoses and healthcare workers. And a lot of published work has come out during the initial pandemic phases in the US, at least in March. So what we're trying to look at is what demographic groups in the general population in Wisconsin have the highest burden of psychological symptoms, and how does perceived COVID-19 exposure, testing, and preventative behaviors differ among those with psychological symptoms and those with depression or anxiety symptoms. So briefly, as I mentioned, SHOW is a statewide representative population health survey infrastructure. We've been collecting data from 2008 until present. In 2020, we switched gears to create a COVID-19 community impact online survey. We invited all past participants to take this survey. And in May to June, we had around 1,400 individuals complete the survey. What I'm going to show you today has a total N of 1,370 individuals who completed the PHQ-4 screener. So to determine who has mental health symptoms, we used a clinically relevant PHQ-4 cutoff of 6 or greater. And as you can see, we found in the overall sample that 11.6% of individuals had mental health symptoms. As expected, we saw more women as well as more individuals with a lower educational attainment who had mental health symptoms. We saw the greatest percent of symptoms in those 18 to 35 years old. And despite only 7.5% of our sample identifying as Black or African American, almost 20% of those individuals reported having mental health symptoms. As most of you know, any past history of mental health diagnosis is really important to consider when looking at current symptoms. So we wanted to break down who had a past history of symptoms versus those who did not. And we found that around 50% of individuals who are currently showing symptoms had some past history. We also found that those with a past history were more likely to identify needing care as well as seeking out care. But overall, it looks like a pretty low percent of the individuals with mental health symptoms are actually seeking care when they need it. And one thing that's really great about the SHOW survey is that we collect information on all sorts of social determinants of health. So I really zoomed in on some basic needs and whether those needs are being met here. So looking at current employment status, as we would expect, we saw a greater proportion of those with mental health symptoms who are not working for pay right now. And interestingly, we found 35.6% of those without symptoms who are retired. So this is showing a key difference between the no mental health and mental health symptoms groups, which we'd like to explore more later. In terms of food insecurity, you can clearly see that those with mental health symptoms are far more concerned about whether or not their food will run out, whether their food lasted, and whether they could afford to eat balanced meals. We also found that 23.5% of individuals with mental health symptoms reported they could not afford to pay rent or a mortgage at any point during the pandemic, compared to only 12% of those with symptoms. and 23.5% of people with mental health symptoms are worried about losing their job in the next 3 months, compared to only 7.5% with no symptoms. So a couple key findings to date is that 11.5% of our sample is showing current mental health symptoms. About half of those individuals have a history of mental health diagnosis. Less than 15% were trying to access care and unable to because of the pandemic. And food insecurity is far more likely to affect those with mental health symptoms. There's also greater concerns about losing jobs and housing among those with mental health symptoms. A couple limitations, I'm sure multiple of you noticed that our response rates were fairly low, and this led to more of a non-representative sample than we typically would get with a show program. So we found that our demographics are a little bit older, more educated, higher income, and white. We also found that the demographic and employment differences between the no symptoms and the mental health symptoms groups are could be pretty significant. So we'll need to explore those further with regression modeling. And we had wanted to look more into COVID-19 testing and behaviors around that. But at the time when this survey was conducted in May and June, testing was pretty limited in Wisconsin. So for some of the next steps, we have 2 additional follow-up surveys planned. One is going to be starting in December, and one will be at 1 year. And hopefully we can assess some more of those COVID testing related variables that we're interested. And we can also look at longitudinally how mental health symptoms might be changing over the long term. And we also want to explore more regression modeling as well as potentially interactions. So quickly, I want to acknowledge my co-authors as well as the show team. We also had a lot of input from other University of Wisconsin-Madison faculty to develop the survey. And I'd like to thank the show participants as well. Thank you.